my favorite seat. Uh-oh.
And you will know my name is the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
Would you believe me if I told you Pulp Fiction was a Disney movie, or The Sixth Sense, or even The Royal Tenenbaums? Believe it or not, yes, these are all films that are either produced in-house or directly distributed by Walt Disney Studios themselves. In the 1980s, Disney founded two different pseudonym labels to produce and distribute adult-oriented movies under, that being Touchstone Pictures and another called Hollywood Pictures. In the early 90s, they also acquired Miramax, an independent film studio that focused purely on making experimental adult indie films. Before Disney ever bought Lucasfilm, Fox, or Marvel, this is the start of them truly beginning to diversify their image and branding and what kind of stories they wanted to tell. So how exactly did this come about to begin with, and why exactly is it not a thing that seems to be around anymore? Well, that's what I want to explain today, but specifically, I want to explain how in many ways, this particular era of Disney more than likely represents their most experimental, boundary-pushing era overall, and an era they've never really replicated the sheer creativity of since. There's a lot that can really be learned from this particular era of Disney, since in many ways it does reflect why the company is where it is now with the many mediocre products it has chosen to put out in recent memory.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
Good golly, I'm tired of live-action remakes. Our story starts in the late 1970s, about a decade after Walt Disney himself had passed away due to lung cancer. In the years following Walt's death, Disney had seen success with a few films like The Jungle Book, the last animated film Walt had worked on, and a few live-action family films like The Love Bug. However, in the 1970s, Disney began to notice a shift in the kinds of movies that audiences were going in droves to see, namely event movies like Jaws, and especially... Yep, that one. Star Wars was a film that absolutely changed filmmaking as a whole for many years to come, and Disney wanted to create films that could capture the teen and adult audience demographic more. In 1979, they released a movie that they hoped would capture the exact audience Star Wars had, called The Black Hole. The Black Hole is notable for being much darker than your average Disney film at the time, and actually being the first movie released by Disney to be rated PG. Unfortunately, they ultimately did not capture the audience they wanted with this film, and it ended up being a major flop. Disney attempted this strategy again in the years 1980 and 1982 with the supernatural mystery Watcher in the Woods and the incredibly innovative sci-fi live-action computer animated hybrid film Tron, which, of course, I bear particular fondness towards. Unfortunately, neither performed to Disney's expectations either. It was becoming clear that audiences had grown accustomed to the Disney brand automatically equating to children's films, and something a teenager would attempt with their family as opposed to a date. Eventually, then chairman of Disney, Ron Miller, who was also the son-in-law of Walt Disney himself, decided that there needed to be a separate label to differentiate films that were meant to have more prestige or tackle societal issues and were usually aimed at older viewers, that could set themselves apart from the traditional Disney fare. As a result, Disney ended up creating the Touchstone Pictures branch of their company, which would aim to make these exact kinds of films. The Disney executives named Kramer vs. Kramer, Tootsie, and E.T. as being explicit examples of the kinds of films they were wanting to make, films that could tap into a different kind of filmmaking than Disney had previously been known for. The first release from Touchstone was Splash, a romantic comedy about a man finding a mermaid starring Daryl Hannah and Tom Hanks. The film ended up being a surprising success for Disney, earning $69 million against an $11 million budget, which, to Disney, proved this experiment might be something worth pursuing further. However, directly after this film launched, Roy E. Disney, the nephew of Walt Disney himself and son of co-founder Roy Disney, chose to resign from the Disney board, largely as a means to get Ron Miller removed as CEO. He and many other members of the board had viewed Ron's decisions as ones that had been weighing the company down and drifting farther and farther from the original values that Walt had ultimately created success for them to begin with. As a result, Miller was ousted from the company, and new talent was brought in from Paramount, that being Jeffrey Katzenberg, Frank Wells, and Michael Eisner. Eisner ended up becoming the new CEO of the company, and Wells became Eisner's right-hand man, who stood by his side to keep his bigger ideas in check and within reasons for Disney's best interests. Jeffrey Katzenberg, aka aka the Disney Boogeyman, would helm Disney's animation department, which around this time would have a huge resurgence in success. Thanks to the Disney Renaissance beginning and creating timeless classics such as The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King. All three men were still actively involved in attempting to beef up Disney's live action output as well, however, and in 1986 they released Disney's first ever R-rated movie, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, under the Touchstone banner. This ended up being a major commercial success for Disney, with the film even netting its lead actress, Bette Midler, an Oscar nomination, something Disney had not seen in quite a long time. While Walt Disney himself had actually netted 22 Oscar wins and 59 nominations in his lifetime, since his death in 1966, the company had not been able to secure a single Oscar nomination, let alone wins since then, aside from a posthumous award given to Walt for a Winnie the Pooh short. So the fact they were able to earn a nomination from what was at the time the first ever R-rated Disney film with an actress who had been on the decline was a signal that maybe this experiment would pay off after all. Were they correct? Well, let's see what came after this. Following the success of Down and Out in Beverly Hills, Disney decided to go with the same tactic for another Touchstone release, that being Good Morning Vietnam, starring Robin Williams, who at the time was recovering from a drug addiction and slightly disgraced image. As a result, he was easy for Disney to sign to the film without expanding the budget too much, and this strategy proved successful again, with Good Morning Vietnam being another hit. Disney would continue this strategy for Touchstone with other movies like Ruthless People and Dead Poet Society, also reusing Bette Midler and Robin Williams, among other affordable actors, and in turn reaping huge profits. With the clear success of Touchstone, Disney actually ended up releasing more films under this label than through the traditional Walt Disney Pictures label in the 1980s. While Touchstone seemed like a perfect outlet to produce relatively low-cost films that could still turn a huge profit, this would actually change in 1988 when Disney teamed up with Steven Spielberg and also Robert Zemeckis, who had previously directed Back to the Future. They were all collaborating to produce Who Framed Roger Rabbit, easily the most ambitious film that Touchstone, and arguably the Disney company as a whole, had ever produced at the time, blending 2D traditional animation seamlessly on screen with live-action actors. This was the first Touchstone film to cost over $50 million, which actually infuriated both Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, who thought this film was far too expensive. It seemed to go against their entire mentality of low-risk, high-earnings projects. However, despite Eisner and Katzenberg's low expectations, the film ended up being a huge success for Disney, making over $350 million worldwide, and also proving vital in rejuvenating interest in classic Disney animation. Things seem to be going surprisingly well for Disney, far better than they had been doing in 2 decades now. By creating Touchstone Pictures, they had formed not only a way to create films that wouldn't be intended for family audiences, but also diversify their image and brand and give them the ability to tell new kinds of stories. Disney decided they needed to double down on this approach, and in 1989 founded another distribution label that would be able to create the same kinds of films that Touchstone was currently doing, called Hollywood Pictures. Could having 2 different film labels producing the same kinds of movies possibly be an issue at all? No way! That's crazy! What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong?
Disney's hope in founding Hollywood Pictures alongside Touchstone was to double their output of adult films they would be able to produce per year, and this ended up proving to be true, with Disney now having the ability to put out over 40 films per year. Just like Touchstone, Hollywood Pictures was meant to be very cost effective, which is exactly how the studio could afford to put out as many movies as possible per year. The first film Disney made under Hollywood Pictures was Arachnophobia, which at the time was a highly anticipated title by both audiences and critics. Paramount was actually so nervous about this film overshadowing their own horror movie, Ghost, that they moved the release date further away to not be in direct competition with Arachnophobia. However, while Arachnophobia was successful, it wasn't quite the blockbuster Disney had hoped for, earning $53 million against a $22 million budget. Ghost, on the other hand, ironically enough, despite having moved its release, ultimately ended up becoming the blockbuster hit of that summer, making over $500 million. Funny how that works, huh? Hollywood Pictures would continue to struggle to gain any momentum for Disney, with a number of flops piling up under the label, with One Good Cop, The Marrying Man, and Super Mario Bros. Yes, that's right, Disney was the one responsible for the terrible live-action Mario movie from 1993, which, given their recent track record in live-action, isn't all that surprising. Thank God they didn't do the new one. Hollywood Pictures began to seem like more of a detriment to Disney's current rate of success each coming year, which began to worry Eisner and Katzenberg. It was becoming becoming clear that Hollywood Pictures might not actually work out in the long run, since it was ultimately failing to replicate the same success that Touchstone had been able to bring in. Gee, I wonder why? However, a small glimmer of hope appeared in 1982 when Jeffrey Katzenberg ended up coming across a small independent film company called Miramax, which specialized in locating up-and-coming directors and getting their films off the ground. Miramax's films, as a result, were much more experimental and stood out from your average Hollywood flick, which was exactly what Disney was looking for. Unfortunately for them, Miramax was run by none other than Harvey and Bob Weinstein. Good God. Even pre-sex scandal, the Weinsteins were already very controversial figures in Hollywood, with Harvey especially always being extremely brash and aggressive. He always had a very unkept, disheveled appearance about him too. Gee, I wonder why that was. Despite this, the Weinsteins' knack for spotting talent and promising projects was exactly what Disney was looking for at the time. Disney purchased Miramax in 1993, and the first film to be produced with Miramax under Disney was 1984's Pulp Fiction from then up-and-coming director Quentin Tarantino. Needless to say, Pulp Fiction's legacy speaks for itself, with it often being regarded as one of the most influential and greatest films of all time to this very day, with its unconventional method of storytelling, witty dialogue, and many pop culture references. It was also a huge success for Miramax and Disney at the time, bringing in over $200 million on an $8 million budget and also netted them several Oscar nominations. In fact, in 1994, Disney became the first studio ever to make over $1 billion in a single year, thanks to the success of Miramax's Pulp Fiction, their own animated feature The Lion King, which became a worldwide phenomenon and cultural sensation, The Santa Claus from Walt Disney Pictures and Hollywood Pictures, and Touchstone's When a Man Loves a Woman. Things seem to be finally going the way Eisner and crew had envisioned when they first came to the company from Paramount. However, that very same year, a massive event would occur that threatened to shake up the future of the Disney company's success forever. But before I get into exactly what that was, I'm going to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already. If you've enjoyed this video so far, you'll likely enjoy my other videos as well, since I cover all film-related topics here. Consider joining my Discord as well, where you can suggest topics for me to cover here on YouTube in the future. Also, I do stream on Twitch, so if you like watching Tron Otters play video games, go check me out there as well. You can also check out my letterbox, which should be linked down below also, where I review movies and shows, oftentimes movies and shows I may not review here on YouTube. All links are down in the description. But anyway, back to the story at hand. In 1994, then president of Disney, Frank Wells, who had also been there to inform all of Michael Eisner's decisions and keep them reasonable, died in a skiing incident when a helicopter crashed. This immediately sent ripples throughout the company, with many uncertain of what this meant for the foreseeable future. With Wells's position now needing to be filled ASAP, Jeffrey Katzenberg assumed he would take the role of president, since Eisner had previously promised him the position should Wells ever leave the company. However, Roy E. Disney forced Eisner to back down on this, saying he would go to the shareholders and force them to withdraw if Katzenberg was made president, since ultimately he didn't really like Katzenberg at all. Gee, I wonder why? This infuriated Katzenberg, who ultimately left the company in August of 1984 and later went on to found DreamWorks with cohorts Steven Spielberg and David Geffen. With Eisner now essentially filling two positions, however, being both CEO and president, all the more responsibility fell to him, which, with Wells no longer around to keep him in check, seemed like a troubling sign of things to come. And lo and behold, it absolutely was. What a shock. One of the first big mistakes that Eisner made when it came to Disney's live-action output in the post-Wells era came in the form of a script that was submitted to Disney from up-and-coming director M. Night Shyamalan.
What a twist!
Who actually had previously worked with Disney by doing Wide Awake for Miramax. David Vogel, Disney's agent at the time, caught wind of this script and immediately recognized how brilliant it was and how much it could easily be a major win for Hollywood Pictures, which desperately needed it at this point, having only created 12 bona fide hits out of 70 different films. However, when this film was presented to Eisner, he had very little faith in the project and decided to sell off the international and domestic rights of the film to Spyglass Entertainment, much to Vogel's horror. Eisner feared the film would just be another money-losing project from Hollywood Pictures, and so he chose to lessen the risk by just obtaining the distribution fee, which gave Disney 12% of the film's gross. Needless to say, this is a plan that very much backfired, since not only did Sixth Sense surpass all expectations and become easily the highest grossing film from Hollywood Pictures, earning over $600 million, but also at the time became the highest grossing live-action movie Disney had ever produced. However, thanks to Spyglass now owning the majority of the rights, Disney saw very little return from the Sixth Sense. After having two more flops in the early 2000s, the Hollywood Pictures label was finally dismantled for good, with corporate meddling having completely shot their one chance at success dead on arrival. This now just left Miramax and Touchstone as the remaining adult avenues that Disney had under their control. Unfortunately, things weren't going so well those currently either. Miramax in particular seemed to be getting into trouble since, while they had produced many successful films since Pulp Fiction, such as Clerks, The Crow, and Scream, Harvey and Bob Weinstein were under major scrutiny from Disney for seemingly wasting a lot of the money the company was giving them, oftentimes just blowing through cash while the two brothers argued over how a particular film should be made. Things would really come to a head, however, in 1997 when Disney reached a landmark deal with Studio Ghibli, the acclaimed Japanese animation studio renowned for making some of the greatest animated films of all time, to distribute their films in North America and also produce the English dubs for many of Miyazaki's films. Miyazaki was reluctant to work with Disney at first, being a notable critic of American ideals and American film overall, but eventually was persuaded by Pixar's John Lasseter, who of course is his own can of worms, but was a big fan of Miyazaki's work, and ultimately did get him to complete the deal with Disney. The first film that would be distributed by Disney was to be Princess Mononoke, which was sent over to Miramax to be distributed through their label specifically. Can you guess where this is going? Of course, Harvey, being the arrogant jerk he is, was incredibly unsatisfied with Princess Mononoke, thinking it was too long and empty, and told Miyazaki he needed to cut it down to 90 minutes. Miyazaki naturally did not take kindly to this and ended up sending Harvey a samurai sword with a note attached saying no cuts. Even after this pretty blatant message, Harvey still tried to argue the point, but eventually did relent to Miyazaki, and Princess Mononoke was ultimately released as how he saw fit. You know, given the fact Miyazaki had to deal with two of Hollywood's most notoriously awful men, I kinda see why he hates America. Despite the fact that Mononoke was released to the public and Miyazaki stayed mostly satisfied, Disney had seen firsthand how unwilling Harvey was when it came to working with other filmmakers, even when it meant there would likely be large profitability lost. Ultimately, this came as more of a sign to them that Harvey was not the person to preserve their cost-effective practices. Not long after, Harvey received a pitch for an adaptation of the Lord of the Rings books from Peter Jackson, who had previously worked for Disney and Miramax with Heavenly Creatures. Jackson wanted to make 3 movies adapting the books, but knew Miramax probably wouldn't sign off on this, so opted to pitch 2 movies instead. Harvey liked this idea and brought it to Eisner, who unfortunately promptly rejected it. After seeing how Harvey had squandered most of his company's money, he wasn't really willing to do a 2-part film deal with Miramax, and told Harvey they'd have to do it in 1 film if they wanted to do it. After hearing this, Peter Jackson left Disney and decided to shop his idea around at other studios. Eventually, the rights for Lord of the Rings were picked up by New Line Cinema, which was a subdivision of Warner Brothers. They ended up giving Jackson the 3-movie deal he wanted to begin with, and the rest is history. With the Lord of the Rings films becoming some of the most profitable and most acclaimed films of all time at a totally different studio, the losses seem to be piling up for Miramax. On top of this, Eisner and the Weinsteins continued to butt heads over finances. Eventually, after their contract expired in 2005, the Weinsteins left Disney, and Miramax was later sold off by Disney in 2010. So now, the only avenue they had left was Touchstone. How are they doing this whole time? At this point, do you really have to even ask? Well, Touchstone had seen some surprising successes in the 2000s, such as M. Night Shyamalan's newest films Unbreakable and Signs, and up-and-coming directors Wes Anderson's films Rushmore and the Royal Tenenbaums. Disney had also began a brand new live-action franchise around this time in the 2000s under the Walt Disney Pictures label, that being Pirates of the Caribbean. These films were massive successes for the company and ended up proving to them that they could still release films with darker elements under the main Disney banner and still reap huge profits. Following the success of Pirates and the National Treasure movies, as well as Disney's purchase of Marvel in 2009 and Lucasfilm in 2012, Touchstone's output began to slow dramatically from what it had been in the 80s and 90s. In 2009, they ended up entering a deal with Steven Spielberg and DreamWorks to co-produce a number of films together, some of which ended up being big successes, such as Spielberg's own Lincoln and also Bridge of Spies. Touchstone also distributed The Wind Rises from Studio Ghibli in North America around this time, which was going to be Hayao Miyazaki's last film he would work on before reversing that decision with The Boy and the Heron. The last film that Touchstone made was The Light Between Oceans in 2016. Following this, their deal with DreamWorks and Steven Spielberg had been completed, and Steven went to Universal to co-produce his next several projects. To this day, this is still the last time the Touchstone label has ever been used for a film nearly a decade later. This marks not only the end of Touchstone Pictures, but the last breath of an era of Disney as a company that we likely will never get back. Touchstone Pictures and Hollywood Pictures were both founded by Disney as ways to try and break the mold of what Disney as a brand was known for and create timely films that could tap into different subject matter, or be targeted squarely at adult audiences. In a lot of ways, Miramax was bought by Disney for the same reason, to create groundbreaking indie films that could be launched into theaters to help Disney stand out even more, although ultimately, that backfired thanks to Weinstens meddling. However, this is such an interesting era for Disney as a whole, and it especially stands in stark contrast to where the company is currently at, where they have almost the complete opposite mentality they once had on this sort of filmmaking. Where they once were wanting to create purely original, life-changing films that could be talked about for generations, they now have gone all in on milking franchises as much as they possibly can, making every single Marvel or Star Wars penny bleed till it's dry. In addition to this, with Disney now owning Fox, the kinds of films Touchstone would have made are now more or less made under Searchlight Pictures, although with nowhere near the amount of frequency and proficiency that Touchstone was able to pull off. In a lot of ways, if Hollywood Pictures had not been founded alongside Touchstone, we might be in a future where Touchstone still exists and makes incredibly introspective, timely movies. But sadly, that is not the case, and Disney chose to shoot themselves in the foot by creating two different film labels that basically did the exact same thing. Seriously, I still do not understand that decision to this day. But overall, the legacy of Disney's adult films in the 90s have still left a pretty lasting impact on Disney's history as a whole, and in many ways, Disney would not be here today without them. Maybe someday we'll see Disney return to this more introspective era of filmmaking once their live-action remakes have dried up. But then again, maybe not. But what do you think? Am I wrong about this? Is Disney secretly still making good movies and I'm just horribly wrong? Let me know down below. Special thanks to my patrons GDC1996 and Trayvon Gibson for supporting me over there. Patrons get early access to every video and exclusive content. Once again, you can also check out my Twitch streams and join my Discord to catch up on what I do overall and offer suggestions for the next video I do. You can check out my Letterboxd, as stated before as well, where I often review movies that I won't cover here on YouTube. But anyway, I've been Otterly Noah, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye!